And I'm going to be talking about fisheries, and fisheries are so complex on our coast, and there's been such a rich history and a complex history. It would be, foolish to think we could do all this in half an hour. And so I've kind of cherry picked some of the key items and some of the popular fisheries that you may have heard about or that still exist today to focus on. And there's many other elements of the fisheries that we won't go into, but hopefully this will give you a taste of where we've come from and what some of the challenges are going forward. So this is the region I'm going to talk about here, which is the Salish Sea, or as previously known in many places as the Strait of Georgia, and we'll talk about the fisheries in that region. You can see the map on the right there. It's quite interesting. It shows the bathymetry of the area, and you can see out in front of Seashelt in the coast there, it goes down to over 400 meters in depth, which is quite fascinating to think of the depth out there. And then you can see the blue and the purple, it gets shallower. And there's along the Sunshine Coast, you can see there's a shallow bench, which actually plays a significant role in attracting fish to our coastline here. This is a bit of a picture snapshot of not every single species, but it shows the majority of the elements of the food web within the Salish Sea. And you can see from the bottom, it talks about importing, and that's importing nutrients largely from the ocean into all of these different sort of species and food systems. And then at the bottom in the red, you get the planktons and the algae, which are sort of the base of the food chain, the phytoplankton and the zooplankton going up. And then you get krill and squid and shrimp and jellyfish as you move further up. And then you get into the fin fishes, the herring and the oolakan, and the forage fishes, the small fish, which we sometimes call feed fish for other larger things. And then you get into all the different types of rockfish and seabirds and salmon and cod and all kinds of other larger fish you may be familiar with. And then, of course, at the top of the food chain, you get into the seals and the orcas. And at the very top is the transient orcas, which actually feed more on the seals. And you see the other orcas feed more largely on the finfish. So that gives you a sense of what's out there. And again, this isn't all the fish. And sometimes in these categories, whether it's salmon or rockfish, there's multiple species within those categories. So we have quite a magnificent diversity. And we'll see as I go through the presentation, some of our challenges are really about abundance of fish and what our role is in causing their demise and potentially putting in place conservation measures to recover them. So back in the beginning, we'll look at one of the first fisheries, and there's records back over 10,000 years where indigenous communities along the coast in the Salish Sea had fished herring, and there's herring bones that have been found in middens. And it was quite early that they developed these rakes, which were basically cedar poles with carved bone as needles that were impelled into the wood there. And then the herring were so rich and thick when they came to spawn along the coast, they could literally just sweep their rakes along and throw the fish into their boats. And so it was a remarkable abundance that made it quite easy for them to catch fish. The indigenous communities also learned early that as the fish came up the rivers, they could find spots like this where they could actually build weirs to direct the salmon into a trap in the center of the weir there, where they could go and take as many fish as they wanted out of there, and made, again, quite an efficient and easy way to capture a large amount of fish in a reasonable amount of time. And then they were also quite innovative in that they developed fishing in the way of hook and line, with these curved hooks of wood and bone. And amazing, really, when you think back how they figured out that the fish could bite and they could get caught on this hooked apparatus. And they went out and caught salmon and halibut and in their canoes. And it's quite remarkable that they were able to do that for years. But again, the abundance of fish was such that you didn't have to go out very far. There's stories about catching 80, 100-pound halibut right off of the beaches at UBC and that whole area in Vancouver, where you could just catch so many fish and large fish. And one of the fish that you may have heard of that was quite important to the indigenous communities was the oolakan. And on the map there, you can see the distribution of these fish. And they tend to, they spawn in large rivers. So they go into the fresh water in the Fraser, the Skeena, and a lot of the big rivers on our coast. And they were one of the key fish for coastal communities because they were so rich in oil that the fish were used for multiple things. They were medicinal at one level. They were used to preserve food. They would take the fish oil and mix it with their dried berries to make berry cakes that would last the winter, because this oil had this magnificent property of not spoiling. So they could keep oil in containers for over 2 years and still use it. And that was good because the run cycle sometimes came only every second year. So this oil was quite prized, and it was traded both into the interior on what they called the grease trail, where they took this oil and traded it with interior First Nations for other commodities, and also down the coast where they didn't have so much oolakan. But there was some, and that's why I raised it here. It actually was in the Squamish and the Hamathko rivers nearby. The Coast Salish people harvested oolakan, and there's one story of oolakan at Toba Inlet that used to be there and then were no longer there after one of the enemies hung a dead bear at the estuary, and they said from that point the oolakan never came back. But the Stolo also in the Fraser, there was an oolakan run on the Fraser, but despite its abundance, which you can see here, just colossal abundance of fish, which they would put in these pens after they catch them, and then they would let them what they call ripen, which is basically start to rot. If you can imagine a mass of fish that big rotting away, and then it would be softer and mushier and they could press the oils out of it. But quite a magnificent sight when you see that volume of fish, and that was present in so many rivers up and down the coast. But for reasons still not totally understood, in about 2004, the majority of these fish in the rivers on the BC coast just disappeared down to remnant levels, and some just totally disappeared. But the Nass River on the north coast is one of the few that still has a really abundant run that they harvest from. But in other areas, it's been so decimated that they've closed fisheries, and any other fishery like the shrimp trawl fishery, which had a high bycatch of oolakan, they shut down that fishery, even though the shrimp are very abundant, super abundant, but they won't let them fish because they have such a high bycatch of oolakan, because those species inhabit the same habitat in the ocean. So it's one of those fish that, you know, people want to get back. We hope they'll recover, but the science is still unclear about what's going on and why they've been so decimated. So anyway, First Nations had a heyday for centuries, fishing on our coast and living off of that fish. And then along came the settlers and, you know, caught fish that they had only ever dreamed about, like this fella here with his big 50-pound Chinook salmon. And they would go out in their little rowboats. And again, there were so many fish, it was quite easy. Imagine hauling in these big fish if you'd come from somewhere else and never imagined such massive protein in one animal. But it became a destination. BC coast was a destination for sure for people who wanted to fish. And so then they said, well, we need to catch these fish faster and better and make an economy out of this. So along came the gill nets. These are some of the first gill net boats, these little wooden boats with these wheel rolls that they hauled in the gill nets on and pulled all the fish out. Now, one of the unfortunate stories on our coast in the Salish Sea is we used to have an abundance of basking sharks. Now, these sharks are not predatory, they're pelagic feeders, so they feed on plankton and krill. And but, you know, the word shark was bad enough that they were seen as a negative thing in the fishery, but also they used to get tangled up in the gill nets. And, you know, if they destroyed a gill net, that would cost a fisherman hundreds of dollars. And the fish itself, the whale shark, was usually harvested for its liver, which they could only get 3 cents a pound for. So it was a lot more expensive to lose your net than, you know, the money you'd get from harvesting one of these things. So the fishermen started calling on the Department of Fisheries to put out a bounty on these things to eradicate them. And that went on for years. And then finally, the government did determine or made a statement that they were considered a nuisance species. And so people were encouraged to get rid of them. And they did everything, like these sharks would be at the surface to a large degree. Most of the time. And so they were easy pickings. They were shot, they were harpooned. They even created a big boat with a large curved knife on the front where they would ram them and literally cut them in half. And they basically eradicated these animals from the Salish Sea. And I think the first one in decades was seen in 2016. They saw 2 of them, I think. And so there's a hope that they will at some point come back, but they were absolutely decimated. And just to give you the size of it, you can see the person here in the picture on the left, and this shark is literally as big as a bus. And you can see on the right it's called the knife boat ramming the shark. And then, of course, one of the most historic, iconic pictures of the West Coast is these trollers. So these were boats that had these large V-shaped poles that went out the side of the boat, and they could run several lines off of them, so they could troll many lines at once. And they were very popular in targeting all types of salmon. They could fish at different depths. They could fish different times of the year and catch salmon of all kinds. And when they're quite in abundance, the fishery took off. And you can see all the boats here. It was quite an army of troll boats on the BC coast. And you know, in the early days, there was only a few, and then they grew and grew and grew, so that there was many, many more. In the end of the day, there was over 1,600 vessels, they estimated, on the coast, and they had freezers on board so they could go out for days at a time and catch lots of fish. But then as the fishery started to decline, the government put in several measures over the years, which bought back licenses, bought boats off of fishermen, tried to basically reduce the capacity of the fleet. And this was a real impact for coastal communities, because it was a lot what they called the owner-operator, small boat fleet owners, who lived in communities on the coast, made their livelihoods trolling. And in the Indigenous community as well, they had lots of licenses. But when the government did the buyback, a lot of Indigenous fishermen who are older chose to sell their license back to the government, sell their boat, and the community then lost that fishing opportunity. And so by 2000, the boats were down to less than 600. And since then, they've even declined more. And there's a lot of people trying to figure out if there's a way to recover that coastal fishery. But what happens is the infrastructure in the towns, like a packing plant, an ice plant, all the things you need to market that fish go away because there's not enough business. And then it makes it hard to go out and catch fish in that way, because it's too hard to get processing. And in parallel, over the last decade, as we know, we've also seen a big decline in salmon. So it's not a great time to try and figure that out. But some are arguing that it's a more efficient way and a better way, because as you can see here with trolling, you get these very fresh fish, so the fresh catch, instead of fish that have been squished in a seine net or tangled up in a gill net. It's you get a very nice clean fish when you catch it by trolling. And you can see the picture on the right, how they drag the lines, and on the boat there's the fisherman. He's got this hydraulic system that has several reels along the line there that he can, when he gets a fish on, he can reel up whichever one he wants with his hydraulic winch, throw it into the hold. And another part of our history fishing was the famous Vancouver Sun fishing derbies. You know, again, the superabundance of fish out there led people to want to go fishing, and they came in droves. They came by the hundreds to go fishing in Howe Sound and around Bowen Island and up the Sunshine Coast. And there was prizes, there was cash prizes for, you know, the biggest fish, the most fish, the youngest person with the biggest fish, and all kinds of categories. But it was apparently quite a sight. And there were so many images like this, sort of relic images from the Vancouver Sun of hundreds and hundreds of people in boats and on the docks, and big smiles on their faces. And you know, that is largely gone now. So it's really an amazing part of the history of our area that, you know, it just isn't there in the capacity it was. And this is part of what was happening, was that the fleet was growing and growing. And this is the Steveston fish plant, and you can see the number of boats in the harbor here. I mean, it was a phenomenal sight, and the number of boats that would go out every season was remarkable. Thousands of boats, and they would ply up and down the coast depending on where the fish were and what run was coming in, because as you know, salmon come in different times of the year, and So they were fishing different ways and different kinds of boats with different gear. And a lot of it went to the big packing plants in Richmond, and there was others up the coast as well. But in this region, it was in Richmond. And then along came technology as it evolved and evolved, of course. You got these bigger and bigger boats, these high-tech boats with what they called seine nets. And these are purse seines. You can see the small boat in the pictures on the left there, circles the net around a school of fish, takes it right around in a loop, locks it up. And then, as you can see in the big picture in the lower right, the boat starts to haul in the net, and it's like a big purse. It concentrates all the fish. And then, as you can see in the top right, they're hauling that big purse up into the deck, and all the fish go into the hold of the boat. And there was actually, as you can see the abundance here, there was cases where they boarded so much fish, the ship went down, right? It just, the mass was overwhelming for the size of vessels they had in some cases. And the one on the lower left there is actually a seine boat that has herring. They use the same method to catch herring when the herring are spawning, and they're in these mass aggregations, very easy to capture by seine nets like this. So it came to the point in our history where there was so much fishing capacity in the way of gear and men on the coast that the government determined that, if they left it open, they had the capacity to fish out the entire BC coast pretty much. So that's when they started to go on these buyback programs, where they started concentrating licenses, buying back licenses, incentives to sell boats, like all kinds of stuff to reduce the size of the fleet. That also resulted in a kind of capitalization by the wealthier fishermen who were able to buy up licenses and things like that. And it got very concentrated by a man named Jimmy Pattison, the Canadian, who bought the Canadian Fishing Company. And he now owns the majority of the quota on many fisheries and actually leases out boats to fishermen to go fishing. But the owner-operator style of fishing was largely changed on the BC coast. And unfortunately, in the Salish Sea, we saw this decline in salmon that was quite precipitous in the early 90s. Here you can see coho, which was one of the most dramatic. And on the Sunshine Coast, it used to be one of the most prized and vibrant sport fisheries up anywhere from Seashell north to Powell River. The coho in that area, you're catching about 1 million fish a year. The estimated run size was about 10 million of coho spawning in the creeks and rivers on Vancouver Island and on the Sunshine Coast region. And as you can see, in about 1990, it started to crash. And by 92, it was in a precipitous fall. And, they went from 10 million fish down to 500,000 in a couple of years. And it has never really recovered, which I'll show you some other slides here. Similarly with Chinook, you see in the early 70s, down to 2006, the trend is just down, and it stayed down. Same for steelhead. And so since this happened, many groups, including the Pacific Salmon Foundation and other groups, have been trying to figure out what's happened here and what can we do about it. And is it about fishing? Is it about changes in the ocean? Is it about aquaculture, or what's causing this? And it turns out to be all of the above. We've got warming ocean temperatures, which have changed ocean currents and changed wind patterns and changed the flow of water and the nutrient cycling. You've got acidification of the ocean, and the deep acid water in the offshore, which is normally off the banks, has come up onto the banks and actually washed into the Salish Sea at concentration levels that are detectable and actually harm things like shellfish from actually growing their shells. So, and all the way through the food chain, through the copepods and the zooplankton, it affects the whole food chain. So that's temperature, ocean acidification. You've got pollution, obviously. There was, arguments around overfishing and about taking too many fish, too many spawners. And then we all know about the logging and development history on Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland, which wiped out many, many streams that were important for spawning fish, particularly coho and Chinook. And steelhead, unfortunately, get caught up in the incidental catch in other salmon fisheries. And they're also very sensitive to temperature in rivers. So as we get warming terrestrial temperatures and warming up the rivers, salmonids don't do well in warm water. So they like 18 degrees Celsius or lower. And we've had water temperatures in the Fraser up to 21 degrees. So there's a high mortality when that happens. So here's an aggregate. This is a BC-wide aggregate of the decline in fish for salmon. So you can see all the different species: pink chum, sockeye, coho, and chinook. And you can see the pinks are the dominant mass there in most of these, the black. Then you get the chum, which are the gray. They're also, still relatively abundant. And then sockeye, which were super abundant in some years, have declined dramatically. The coho I've already shown you declined dramatically. They're the little light blue ones here. And then the dark blue on the top are the percentage of the catch that is chinook. So you can see in the stats on the top there from the early decades here, you had to the more recent decades about a 50% decline in the overall abundance of salmon on the BC coast. And that's reflected here on the Sunshine Coast as well, because a lot of these fish that either go up through Johnson Strait and out into the ocean on the north coast or come in through Juan de Fuca, the fish are out at sea, but they migrate through this area either to get to the Fraser or to other rivers in the Salish Sea. So this overall decline in abundance is obviously affecting us here. So sport fishing then came along, obviously, very low tech at the beginning. These were folks that went out literally in rowboats or small powered boats with hook and line to catch their salmon. And again, it was a marvelous recreational opportunity. It was a marvelous tourism opportunity. It was famous, all across Canada. People would come out here to catch these great salmon. And, it really put BC on the map internationally and definitely North America as a fishing destination. But again, the demise of these fish stocks have led to demise in the recreational and tourism opportunities as well. So today we see sport fishing as a much more high-tech operation. The boats are much more advanced. You've got all kinds of sonar gear and tracking equipment that you can find where the fish are. You got depth sounders, you've got all kinds of equipment. And so they still go out though, there's still openings for certain fish at certain times of the year, albeit very short at some times. People are able to go out and they go after halibut, they go after lingcod, they go after salmon. Rockfish, not so much, although they do manage to catch some, and a lot of the areas are closed there, which I'll show you more about. But there's still a lot of demand for fishing, and there's a lot of demand on governments to provide fishing opportunity. And as you've heard, as with the, I don't know if you saw the Southern Resident Orca webinar the other day, but the orca issue and how it relates to Chinook salmon, because Chinook salmon is a primary feed of Southern Resident Orcas, is a very conflict-ridden situation where the sports fishermen obviously would like to catch those fish. There's a whole hatchery production of fish that has developed in BC, and particularly on the South Coast, trying to produce more Chinook salmon. And they clip the fins, so they're called hatchery raised fish. And the sports fishermen say, well, we should be able to catch and keep the hatchery raised fish. But in the meantime, you're catching wild fish as well, and then they're letting them go. And the survival rate on released fish is suspect, right? They know, they've done some studies and they know there's a mortality impact, but it's not 100% clear how much of a mortality. The other thing with a weakened fish, even if it doesn't die, it becomes much more opportune prey for seals to go and catch them, right? Because they're exhausted from being dragged around on a line for half an hour or whatever. So a lot of debate about whether we should allow that recreational fishery, whether the hatchery fish actually can provide that opportunity and not impact the feed opportunity of wild fish for Southern Resident Orcas. There's debate about whether hatchery fish are even targeted by Southern Resident Orcas. And so there's people trying to do scat studies to look at the feed composition with these Southern Resident Orcas. And you can imagine the challenge in trying to capture scat from an orca. But they actually do that, and they have sniffer dogs that go on these boats, and they've been trained to the orca feces smell, and they follow these orca pods. And whenever the dog starts to bark and get excited, they know he's onto the smell. So they go up behind the pods and they try and dip net out the feces before it sinks. And so there's a lot of work going on to figure out what's really happening. But in lieu of really knowing everything, the government has chosen in the last few years to shut down the majority of the salmon fishery for Chinook. And coho has been shut down for many years, since the mid-90s, non-retention of wild fish because of the dramatic declines that they went through. And there is, again, a hatchery production like we see in Capilano, and people can catch those fish. But I just wanted to show you this quickly. This was just released a couple of months ago, which was the new fishing regs for Chinook in the Strait of Georgia. So April 1st, closed until further notice, no retention. Southern Strait of Georgia, same thing. Southern Strait of Georgia, Howe Sound and Burrard Inlet, closed April 1st until further notice. No fishing for Chinook at all. You can't even do catch and release. And then around the Fraser sub areas, no fishing for salmon whatsoever, except for specific openings that they set in season if they think it's appropriate. But the basic picture is you got a huge amount of closures in an area that used to be famous and desired for people to go Chinook fishing. And the other type of fishing people like to do here is fly fishing along the coast for trout, either pink salmon or cutthroat trout. And again, you can keep hatchery raised fish, but not the wild fish. So as with coho and cutthroat trout, you can see in the above right picture here, the adipose fin, the little fin above just before the tail, is cut off on hatchery fish. And you can keep those fish, you can keep 2 a day, but you can't keep the wild fish, which have the adipose fin. So again, popular fish for those avid fishermen who like to go stand out in the chuck and fly fish or otherwise for these fish. Okay, let's cut to rockfish. There's been a lot of talk in the BC fishery about rockfish because they, again, were one of these species that became the poster child of overfishing. The big trawl fleets and the industrial scale fisheries on the BC coast produced a lot of what they call bycatch, killed a lot of fish, netted a lot of fish, didn't track the numbers of all the different species. And there's over 27 species of rockfish. A lot of them are offshore species that were caught, but 5 of the species are common inshore. And these are ones that would be more common around the Sunshine Coast. And these are very sedentary fish. They tend to stay very close to home. And so that means they're very easy to target by fishermen, because if they're on a reef or a rocky reef or an area that people know they can go fish them, and the fish don't go anywhere, they just stay there, and eventually they're going to get caught. So they were very quickly fished out of particular areas. And these are long-lived fish that are slow maturing. They often mature between 5 and 9 years of age, and some of them 15 to 20 years of age before they even start to produce eggs. And so the older, larger females, which produce the bulk of the eggs, like these fish can grow up to 70, 80, even over 100 years old, are very important. So you get these pictures of people with these giant rockfish, and you go, wow, those were the big mamas that are producing thousands and thousands of eggs. And so the government took it very seriously in the 90s and shut down a large part of the rockfish, groundfish fishery on the BC coast. And they came up with the Rockfish Management fishery that had very tight restrictions around bycatch and about recording all the species and about not catching coral as bycatch in the trawls and all kinds of things like that. But on the south coast here, largely they just closed areas to fishing altogether, or they put in place these rockfish conservation areas, which were meant to be off limits for fishing. So I'm just going to show you some of the areas here. This is one you may be familiar with, Area 16, which is Seashell Inlet and up around Texada Island. The speckled red areas are the rockfish conservation areas there. Here we are in Howe Sound, same thing, and Burrard Inlet. Although, you've got these rockfish conservation areas, but then you've also got overlaying Howe Sound an entire closure. So you're not supposed to fish for rockfish anywhere in there. And then you've got on the right this other area, which is offshore from Howe Sound. You can see Area 29, and that area has less, but it does have some. You can see in the very north end there has some rockfish conservation areas. So these areas were established, started in 2002. They were looking at refuges, and in 2007 they set up a massive 164 rockfish conservation areas all up and down the coast, about 20% of the estimated habitat. And all hook and line fishing was closed for lingcod and rockfish. And they banned it totally in some areas in 2007, like I said, in Howe Sound. That's area 28 and 29, just off the coast here. And then between 2009 and 2011, after these rockfish conservation areas had been in place for many years, a woman named Dana Haggerty, who used to be with DFO, did a study. She was doing her PhD and said, well, are these effective? And she was looking at fishing activity in the conservation areas. And there's a lot of it, it turns out. And she also found that the incidence of people fishing within the conservation areas was directly proportional to the distance to the nearest Department of Fisheries conservation officer. And they knew where they were because there weren't very many of them. So they knew if he was in Nanaimo, they could fish here and not get caught. Or if they were in Nanaimo and they knew the guy was in Comox that day, they said, no problem, they're not going to get caught. So enforcement is a real problem, and enforcing regulations around sport fishing is a problem. And they actually determined in some of the rockfish conservation areas, there was more fishing in them than there was before they were established, because people thought, oh, that's a good place to go get rockfish. So, we got problems there, but over the years, the overall message has got out about the decline of fisheries, the need for conservation, and that these areas are there and they're not supposed to be fishing, and people have been reporting illegal activity, and some people have been caught, so that's good. But they also found out that not all the conservation areas were in the best areas. They didn't get it 100% right, but all in all, it has been a benefit to the rockfish population, and hopefully more so going forward. So lingcod was a very specific species in the mix here, which I'll show you that they're absolutely amazing animals. When you look at them, they're fascinating creatures, and they grow to be a huge size. You can get these 30, 40 pound lingcod that'll bite your arm off. It's quite remarkable, the size of them. And they were popular food fish, white meat, very nice tasting fish. And in the early days in the Salish Sea, they were hit hard. So it began in the 1800s. They were fished a lot. They weren't keeping track of the numbers until 1927. And, by 1944, they were taking over 4,000 tons of these things out of the Salish Sea per year, which is a phenomenal amount of biomass. But anyway, by 1991, their stocks were at such low abundance level. They were estimated to be less than 2.5% of the original biomass they estimated in the area. And so they put in closures, restrictions. They totally closed the recreational fishery for 5 years, and tried to figure out a way to recover these. And they're still recovering. They're slowly recovering, but very slowly. In the offshore, off the west coast of Vancouver Island and the central north coast, they've been more prolific at recovering, and the abundance is quite good in a lot of those areas. But in the Salish Sea, they're still challenged, although the reports are the fish are getting bigger. So now you can retain one fish if it's over 65 centimeters, except for certain areas in the sound that are still closed. And this is where I encourage people, you really have to go to the DFO website, to the area, like area 28 where we are, or area 29, and look at the regulations from year to year on which areas are closed, what the catch limits are. And yeah, here's a dramatic chart of the abundance levels, tonnage of catch estimated from 1925 to 2020. You can see it's nothing compared to what it used to be. Let's go to another favorite here, spot prawns. Spot prawns are a favorite catch. The whole movement about eating local and catching local and all that plays out with these little guys, because we catch them locally, and they're a delicious shellfish to eat, and they're easily caught with trap gear. And the only challenge we've found here recently in the last decade is that we've got these sponge reefs out there, which have become quite famous, and government's working to protect them, but they also happen to be near the habitats on rocky reefs and reefs where prawns like to hang out. And so you get the picture like on the right here where someone pulls up his prawn trap and he's got a big chunk of the sponge reef he's ripped off there. And so these traps can cause damage. So where they've protected the sponge reefs, and you can see the green area in Howe Sound, which is where the sponge reefs largely are located, there's provisions to not have any fishing take place in those rockfish or in those sponge reef areas. And there's a 150-meter buffer on each side as well. So it's really important for anyone who wants to go out recreational fishing for prawns to know where those boundaries are, because it's pretty steep fines if you get caught. Now they can confiscate your gear, your boat, fine you, send you to jail. They can do all kinds of things, and they have done that. So these maps show on the red areas where the sponge reef conservation area closures are. You can see the ones in Howe Sound with the little buffers around them. They're often on top of or adjacent to rockfish conservation areas, because again, that same rocky reef habitat that the rockfish like, the prawns like. And there's the sports guys who go out, different kinds of gear, all kinds of gear. You can get traps of all sizes. Then there's the commercial guys, the guy in the yellow jacket there with the bigger boats. That's a commercial boat there in the lower right, and they set out dozens of these big traps, and you can see them out in Howe Sound and around Bowen Island and up the strait. And yeah, they've been at the dock here for the last few weeks, so it's been a productive spot prawn season from all accounts. And the best thing to do is I recommend you go to this website here. I put a link here, and I'm just going to click to it quickly here just to take a look. But yeah, when you go to the site to DFO, you get this Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, and you can get a general overview. You can get access and allocation information. You can get everything you need to figure out where, when, and how to fish. So I recommend if anyone's going out fishing, they go to these sites on the DFO website and read the current information and postings. It's really important to do that. Okay. And yeah, I pulled a little piece out of that report just to show you. So if you look here, you can say, okay, I'm going to go out fishing and look for prawns, where I'm going to go. And it tells you the specific areas, if I'm going in Lund or Saanich Inlet or wherever I am. And you can click on that and it gives you all the details and what type of gear you can use, etc. So very specific. There's so much, because of the demise of the abundance, Department of Fisheries has had to get microscopic at its management level, right? So this area is open, this area is closed, all these areas aren't. You can only use this type of gear. Your gear has to have escape traps, and everything else. So anyway, that's spot prawns. And this one, I think we already looked at that. This was I should have had this up a bit further, but just again, the demise of Chinook and coho in the Strait of Georgia. So let's go to crabs now. Now, this was an interesting one. The Howe Sound region used to be quite famous for crab fishing, both commercial and recreational. But as the Britannia mine developed in Howe Sound, and they discovered that the effluent coming off that mine and the acid mine drainage and all of the heavy metals that were leaching out of the rock and the tailings ponds from this mine were literally poisoning the Sound. And the shellfish became so toxic that they weren't safe to eat. So the whole Sound was largely closed. Now you can see here, this article was from Maclean's magazine, 1989. Yeah, and it talked about the toxins that were found and how they had to go ahead and close the prawn, crab, and oyster fisheries in Howe Sound. So that's an unfortunate legacy, but fortunately they were able over the years to find out ways that they could curtail the acid mine drainage and the leaching of metals and toxins into the environment. And that system is still running. It requires maintenance, and it's something we'll have to do forever, but it has resulted in a decline in toxins and toxicity, so that now they do have recreational fishing limits for crab and prawns, but they do recommend limited numbers of weights per week of consumption, so that you're not filling yourself, because there is still traceable levels of toxins in some of these. And so with crabs, if you go out fishing, they have to be of a certain size. Dungeness crabs, they have to be 165 millimeters. You can only keep the males, which are the ones with the really narrow underbelly carapace. The females that have the wide underbelly carapace, you have to let them all go. Your trap has to have what they call a rot cord on it in space that's big enough for a crab to get out, so that if you lose your trap, the cotton cord rots and the crabs can get out of the trap, and it doesn't keep fishing and killing crabs forever. And again, there's certain areas you can go. Again, you don't want to be dropping these traps on sponge reefs or, destroying eelgrass beds and all kinds of other places that are people are trying to restore at this point. And for your floats, you also need this apparatus with your name. Hey, Smith, that's yours. George, look, George, there's George Crab Trap. And it has to have your license number on it. And you have to have a weighted line down 8 feet from the float so that the line is hanging down. It's not going to get caught in boat motors, etc. And if you don't have that name and number and appropriate setup here, then Department of Fisheries is free to confiscate that trap, which they do regularly. And there's a lot of people out there setting illegal traps right off Bonnie Brook, right off Sunshine Coast. Fortunately, people are reporting this and they have made some big arrests, but people were taking large amount of crabs straight to the Vancouver airport, flying it to Hong Kong, was there within 12 hours. And so we got an enforcement problem. And here's a couple guys that got caught fishing off of Bowen Island in the closed time. They were selling over $4,000 worth of crabs to a restaurant in Burnaby. And the restaurant got fined $72,000. I think the guys got fined $25,000 and $5,000 respectively. The two guys had some of their gear confiscated. They have a requirement to report all their travel activities to DFO Fisheries anytime they're on the water. Yeah, they don't let them off lightly when they break these fisheries rules. So just a warning to people to know what you're doing when you go out there or have deep pockets. And we'll look at clam harvesting. How's my time doing there, by the way?
There's about 10 minutes until 4 o'clock, but
oh my goodness. Okay, I'll speed up.
It's all good.
So, there we go.
Have to scoot out, then they can scoot out. Otherwise, we're happy to have them here.
So clams are the other thing. Again, because of their nutrition and they taste good, people like to fish for them. The beaches are great, except that a lot of the beaches in our region are closed and have often been closed, sometimes due to toxicity from urban pollution and effluents, and sometimes because of paralytic shellfish poisoning and algae and red tide that comes in the warm months. So again, you have to be careful not to eat these things in the wrong season and know where to go. Always look for these signs that are posted up everywhere that tell you when there's a shellfish closure. And general guidelines, obviously check the regulations, have a fishing license, identify the catch, make sure it's legal size, and you've got not more than you're allowed. So things to think of. And so with DFO, their enforcement branch, they're saying, hey, don't stop calling us. They have limited staff and they often get harangued for not responding. But in the end of the day, they are trying to catch the bad guys, and they go on a system of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if they get 30 people phoning in saying it looks like people are taking crabs illegally off Bonnie Brook, then they'll show up there and they'll try and figure out a way to catch these guys. And they do from time to time. They had recently a big bunch of fishermen that got caught putting prawn traps on the sponge reefs in Howe Sound. So they do work. And so we have to work with them as much as possible to keep telling them what's going on when we see it. And moving forward, I guess that's the conversation we'd like to have a little bit, is what do we do? There's obviously salmon conservation needs, restoration projects and salmon habitat to build back in the salmon habitat here in the Squamish River Estuary with the Watershed Society was recovered, where they took an old dried out area that was dried out by dikes and broke the dikes down and rewatered the area, and have taken this area back to this nice tidal marsh, which is great habitat for juvenile Chinook salmon. So there's tons of work like that to be done. There are local stream keepers monitoring, what's coming back to our creeks. Are they spawning? How many are spawning? Do we have habitat issues or other restoration issue needs in our streams? That's work that needs to be done. we ask people to play by the rules, fish responsibly, know the regulations, only take what you need, not what you're allowed to catch. You hear old stories about people saying, I got a freezer full of sockeye. Well, how are you going to eat a freezer full of sockeye? Like, most people can't get through that much fish. So, take what you need and leave the rest. And reporting illegal activity, we talked about that. It's really important. You can take photos of people doing things, send that in, call DFO, write letters to the editor, highlight illegal activity, but don't confront these lawbreakers on your own, because they have had incidents where there's been fist fights over this. And then the person who was doing the reporting, who got in the fist fight with bad guy, got charged with assault. So you don't want to be that person. And lastly, tell government that we need more money. We need fisheries monitoring. We need more enforcement. We need more money for conservation of our fisheries and rebuilding of degraded stocks. And, that is happening to some degree. This year, we got a $650 million budget allocation from the feds to help recover wild salmon. And I think that's the largest single allocation we've seen. So yeah, the calls can make a difference. There's so much more we have to do though. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That's awesome. That was like so much information. I love it. My mind is full, as I'm sure most people's are as well. And we really appreciate you taking the time to share this valuable information with us. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions for Bill. We definitely still have time in our webinar if you'd like to pick his brain a bit more about anything specific from this presentation or an extension of what he was talking about. I might get the questions started. I have a question for you just regarding fishing closures and how, I'm sure it depends on the species, but how quickly after a closure is put in place do you typically see a rebound in population or changes in a population of fish? Because maybe some people might say, oh, it's working, but they've only looked for a very small period of time.
Well, you look at, say, Lingcod in the Strait of Georgia when they put that closure on in 2002 to 2006, and that we're what 20 years later, and the fish aren't at a level of abundance you would think of was there 25, 50 years ago. And so it's decades for something like that, and for rockfish as well, because I mentioned their long maturity cycle and long lived status. They can take decades to recover an area. Other smaller fish, as you go down the food chain into the pelagic fish and the smaller fish, they can recover more quickly because they're super abundant spawners. And even salmon can actually do quite well, although with coho in the Strait of Georgia, because they haven't recovered in over 30 years almost, people are curious. And the Pacific Salmon Foundation undertook a huge project called the Salish Sea Survival Project, and they put millions of dollars into research to try and figure out what is going on in the Salish Sea that's preventing these coho from returning and recovering. And I think they just published their final results recently, 5 years of research, but it's a complicated problem, and a lot of them just there's been a regime shift in the ocean. There's changes at the oceanographic level of the makeup of our ocean water, the acidity, the amount of plankton, the shift in species composition. It's so dramatic that where there's a regime shift, you may not get recovery. As we saw with cod on the Atlantic coast, it's been 27 years since they closed the cod fishery, and it's not recovered yet. So yeah, this is why, taking it to that point where you have overfished it is really the worst thing you can do. You need to have enough spawning and biomass abundance there to hopefully recover the species more quickly. Thank
you. George has a question about the historic salmon numbers in Seashell Inlet. Do you have any more information on that?
I don't have the exact, I could go get that from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, has a very detailed map of the historic abundance in all the little creeks and streams and that, but there was some areas within Seashell Inlet that had large runs of fish. And again, some of them have declined for you know, some of it you could blame on logging, but some of it is just like what happened to the coho. The fish just didn't survive at sea, or the juveniles, you know, didn't make it through the gauntlet. And some of these runs have just been diminished, not disappeared totally, but diminished to such small numbers now, that the recovery time takes a long time. And unfortunately, a lot of these areas in Seashell Inlet and up other parts of area 29 and 16, yeah, they're in bad shape. And it's going to take probably, in that case, decades again for people to do the recovery work and try and get fish back. And then it's, again, it's only as good as the ability of those fish to survive in the ocean and get back to spawn. So climate change is not our friend when it comes to salmon survival.
Thank you. We have another question about some small fish. Looks like there's thousands of little 6-inch long fish that are seen at the mouth of Chaster Creek by kayakers. Do you happen to know what type of fish that might be?
Well, there's been several what they call forage fish in the area, and we know that, like, the Strait of Georgia herring stock is actually one of the most abundant on the coast still. There's a lot of debate about it, whether it should be fished or not fished, or whether we leave the fish for Chinook salmon and orcas and others, or whether it's large enough to fish. And but the bottom line is it's a huge biomass. So there's a good chance you're seeing a lot of juvenile herring. There's also been, in the last 6 to 8 years, an influx of anchovies on the Sunshine Coast, and those have shown up in different places around Bowen Island, in Gibson's, out on the Sunshine Coast, Bonnybrook area, where they come in shore. And you know, it's not 100% sure why they're coming in shore to feed, or whether they're avoiding predators, but they're very dense population. If they're showing any kind of red gill flashes, or you see flashy silver, so their opercles on their cheeks, you know, that'll be the anchovies. And then there's also sandlance, which are these thinner, very silvery, narrow fish, which actually lay their eggs and they hide in the beach sand. And so that's the other type of fish you can see close by at the beach. So could be any of those. You know, unless you dip net them and take a look at them, it's a little hard to know. Just at the top, probably the anchovy is the easiest to identify, is because you see these little speckles of flash from their cheeks.
Yeah, that's great. And to follow up with that, we did have a webinar yesterday evening on forage fish. Diane Sanford was offering that, and she went into lots of detail about the different fish you can find locally. And that recording will be on our YouTube channel this evening. So if you'd like to learn more about those fish, that's where it is. I thought I'd also ask a question, kind of a follow-up from Angela's comment. One of her biggest conservation concerns on the coast is trying to get on-the-ground DFO officers that are based on the lower Sunshine Coast versus being based in Powell River. And I'm wondering how feasible, in reality, how feasible that would be, how likely we could get those people.
Yeah, there's a big fight. When Pamela Goldsmith-Jones was our MP here, you know, a lot of people were complaining about this because they being the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, was shutting down their enforcement office in Squamish. And I think all the people in this whole region were going to be based out of Richmond. And there was only 2 or 3 of them. And so you can imagine coming from Richmond to get to, you know, anywhere in Howe Sound or up the north part of the Sunshine Coast, it's a long trip, and there's a good chance no one's going to be there. So this is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, you got to keep putting in the report, so that if they hear there's a lot of activity there, they know it's worth their time to come up and spend some time and try and see if they can catch someone here, rather than just a one-off incident, which maybe, like, by the time they get here, the people are long gone, so there's no point in them coming. So it would help a lot to have people here. The advocacy from the conservation groups to the MP to get the Squamish person to have an office and stay there was successful to some degree. I think that's happening. And I agree, we should have someone on the Sunshine Coast, the lower Sunshine Coast. And It's all about the budgets and DFO. And as I said in the last slide there, we really need people to pile on our MP, Patrick Wheeler, and say, this has just got to be on the table all the time to get addressed, because as these regulations have highlighted are very complex and change from year to year, even month to month. You need someone here that people can count on to help them when they see problems. So yeah, it's going to take a push. And with all the money the government spent on COVID and every other thing they're trying to do to keep the economy going, it's not a great budget environment to ask for more money, but it's one of those infrastructure things that I think we really need, and the public would respond well to.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you for those thoughtful answers. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask Bill? We have maybe a couple minutes left.
There, see Suzanne's raised her hand.
Raised her hand. Go ahead, Suzanne.
I didn't think I could write this succinctly, and I also just wanted to follow up on what Bill just said about DFO and lobbying Patrick Weiler. I'm thinking like we need SCCA needs a letter writing campaign, really pushing that issue and making it an election issue, because we're heading into that realm soon. So maybe that's something we can work on together. My question of you, Bill, is I know you know a lot about federal policy and how all the laws work and that kind of thing. So McNab, the Burnco mine, in 2018, Burnco got EAO approval from the BC government and from the Canadian government. And I know that the BC approval, it's a 5-year permit. Yeah. And I'm not sure if it's the same at the federal level.
Yeah, it is. Once they get their environmental certificate, they have 5 years to invest or to start the project. Otherwise, they have to do another new environmental assessment process. Okay. And so it's up to the companies whether they proceed with that. And like many, like some of the natural gas plants that were proposed, they've been approved, but they haven't been developed because the big gas companies decided the market's not there, and they may not. And so I've seen some mines in BC as well go through hundreds of millions of dollars of environmental assessment, get their environmental certificate, and then walk away. Yeah. Because they determined they aren't going to make quite enough money, and they have an opportunity to make more money with their capital somewhere else. So yeah, that's the system. And yeah, that's another story at that site, because that river and the spawning channels that were put there were a compensation project from another development. Yeah. And then the spawning channels and that weren't maintained and taken care of. And so then they said, oh, there's no fish in these channels, are not being used, so we might as well develop it. It's kind of perverted. Yeah. And rather than saying, let's take this system, which is one of the few in Howe Sound that has salmon, and maximize the opportunity for salmon to recover there and use it to the degree they can. Instead of that, we say, oh, it's not that big, so not much going on there. Let's just forget about it, which is really sad. So again, it's, the people I thought put up a pretty good challenge to them on that one. And I was quite disappointed that the federal government would see fit to proceed there without considering the opportunity for salmon more fully.
I had a bit more of a question too, and it is that because the SCRD rejected the application by Burnco to process the gravel on the site, so that kind of made the project economically untenable. And then in 2019, the federal government changed the Fisheries Act. So it kind of, I just keep thinking like when those permits come due again, there's an opportunity for them to be rejected, and I would like that to happen.
Yeah, well then we need to get in there and do get everyone we know in Howe Sound to go and do a massive salmon habitat restoration initiative in there to make it a showcase for salmon recovery.
Yeah, because the Chinooks and the orcas and everything's connected. Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for inviting me to host or to give this presentation, and it'll be up on our website for recording, I guess. Is that right? And so if you got friends or others you think might want to see it or listen to the discussion, you can forward the link or let them know it's on our website.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be posting it up on YouTube. Usually it's the day after. So tomorrow afternoon, it will be up there for people to view. We just had one more question from George. Thanks, George and Marilee, for your questions. Really appreciate that. They are asking around some brown water and brown seaweed that's being seen off the Gibson's coastline, so around Keats Island and Bonnybrook. And it hasn't typically been there in the past, and they're just wondering if that's normal or if you've noticed the same thing yourself.
I unfortunately have, been suffering from a broken leg, so I haven't been out anywhere, particularly on the water. But one of the things that's happening with warming waters, and I was surprised. I guess it was 2 weeks ago I saw people swimming, and I thought, oh, that seems a little bit early to be swimming. But the warming waters and the earlier warming waters are causing algal blooms and seaweed concentrations like we haven't seen in certain places before. So it could very likely be that. The other incident is, worst case, you had some kind of more major spill, either, something in the effluent plants went wrong, or a ship incident or something that created something that becomes an algal mess of toxins and pollutants and catches up a lot of seaweed that may come off in natural storms and things and drifts around. So I can't say for sure what it is without obviously seeing it and sampling it. But one thing I do know, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are increased incidents of these algal bloom events happening with the warmer water and the change of acidity in our water in the Salish Sea. I would suggest just don't go swimming in it until you know.
There's been some really warm days lately, so I think that's why people are flocking to the ocean, but yeah. I agree. So thank you so much, Bill. Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat box here, so I think I'll just wrap things up for Very today. Thank you everyone for participating, for joining in on our Zoom. We really, really appreciate it. I've just put a link here in the chat about supporting the SCCA. If you've enjoyed this webinar, if you've enjoyed the films so far in the film festival, we would really encourage you to consider making a donation to the SCCA or becoming an annual member. All of those supports help continue the work that we do, such as a film festival like this. I'll also remind you that the film festival registration is a little different than the webinars. So if you've registered for the webinars and want to see all the amazing films that we may have talked about, I'll put the registration in the link there, as a link for the registration in the chat box. And those films are available to watch until the end of Tuesday, World Oceans Day. And I'll mention a couple of films that are particularly useful to watch after a presentation like this. One of those feature films is called Fish and Men, which is directed by Darby Duffin and Adam R. Jones. And there's a couple short films that might be a good follow-up from today's presentation as well. One on Mosquito Creek salmon habitat restoration and another one on glass sponge reefs. So hopefully you have a chance to watch those. Also, we do have an evening webinar today as well, all on Stream Keepers. So if you'd like to tune into that, there should be a link in your inbox with the Zoom link for that webinar. So we hope you can join us later this evening. Until then, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
See you later.